My name is Brandon Muir. I am the Executive Director of Reclaim New York, and I want to thank you all for having me here tonight. Our goal as an organization is to help people, much like yourselves, that understand the importance of engaging others. The reality is most New Yorkers don't come out to meetings like this because they don't believe that anything can be changed. And part of that reason is because they don't understand the issues. What we decided a couple of years back is if we're not going to be able to take complex issues and break them down and put them in your hands, then who's going to do it, right? We put together a policy team and we did all this research, but at the end of the day, we had a very simple goal, which is to make information digestible. So tonight, what we're going to be talking about is how do we go about thinking about what this budget's going to mean? How do we go about thinking about affordability and transparency and corruption, all these things that we see going around? And so the goal is to give you guys a little bit of a taste of ultimately how we can think about these issues and how we can help our neighbors understand them. Because they're not easy, right? Tax policy and affordability and $84 billion budgets. That's a number that we can't really get our hands around. So we're going to talk about how we might think about that. I want to start tonight with a question that we don't ask a lot. How many of you really understand your relationship with government, right? We pay some taxes and we get some things back. But how many people in this room can tell me what percentage of your earnings goes to government? Too much? A lot? Not enough? Man. This guy. Sir?
Over 50.
Over 50. Okay. Sir? Yeah. The scary part for me is that for a person who studies policy, who finds tax policy interesting, and who knows that my relationship with government is defined in large part by the taxes I pay, I couldn't have a direct answer to that. Now think about that. The largest single expenditure we will make each year is a payment to government. And how is it possible then that we actually can't quantify exactly how much that is? Think about this. At the end of the day, you come home and you say to your wife, honey, had a big day. Well, what'd you do? I spent about 40% of our income. Excuse me? What did you spend it on? Well, I don't really know. Well, did you get value for it? Well, I don't really know. That is not an empowering position, right? And when you think about people who support small business owners and the free market and entrepreneurship, we have to give those people tools to where they can say, this is why we need less government in our lives, right? We need a tool. We need the ability to defend ourselves at the water cooler on Monday morning, right? When one guy walks around and says, if you elect me, I will promise the world. Well, what about the guy who says, if you elect me, I'll get off your back, right? That doesn't sound so great. We need to give people tools, and that was what our organization was created to do. We want to break down all of the political rhetoric, all of the complex policy. When was the last time any of you sat down on a Friday night and read an 80-page white paper about trickle-down economic theory? No, that's unrealistic. So if we don't have organizations that go out there and instead of writing the smart policy paper, break it down, we're going to be stuck. We're going to have trouble messaging. We're going to have trouble talking and explaining and getting people on board. The fact that you're in this room tonight is a huge first step. But how do we empower people who believe in entrepreneurs to get out there and, like they said, bring 9 friends next time? So what we want to talk about tonight is how we do that. The reality of living in New York is that we have an affordability crisis. About a year ago, we released a report which says, guess what, there's an affordability crisis in New York. A week before we did that, an organization that believes in essentially socialism released a report. And I woke up and I heard the news and I thought, oh my gosh, I have to go to my board. And I have to tell my board after a year's worth of work, some organization released a report a week before ours that made the point. But what I realized is they agreed with us. There is an affordability crisis. It doesn't matter if you're on the left or on the right. In New York, there's an affordability crisis. The question is what we do to change that. How do we address that issue? And our hypothesis as an organization is simply saying we need smaller government or we need lower taxes. Lower than what? Right? I want to empower people through our website to go online, to put in your income, and to understand exactly what you're paying in taxes. So I can then go and engage an elected official and say, excuse me, my total tax burden is 42%. I am not getting a return back with paved roads, with safe streets, and with good education. Now I'm having a conversation, I was going to say an argument. Now we're having a conversation as a buyer. Now we're in a position to make demands and to engage government. But you need the information to do that. On the screen, what you're looking at right here, and this is in all of your packets as well, is a breakdown that we did. Now you'll have to forgive me because we did Port Washington. Our organization started on Long Island, moved into the Hudson Valley. We have a regional director in the southern tier. We're hiring for Central New York right now, and we're about to have our first regional director in New York City. So we are just starting to build out neighborhood by neighborhood what this affordability crisis looks like. But I can give you a sneak preview because we already know what it looks like on Long Island. And oh, by the way, it's more expensive in New York City because we've got a city income tax here. What this will tell you is that even at this income point of $106,000, which is almost exactly double the average American family, they can't afford to live. They have $495 left. Now, we invented this term called your wake-up costs. What does it cost you to wake up each morning and put your feet on the floor? You got to pay your taxes, your income, property, sales, and excise taxes. You got to pay basic expenses, roof over your head, food for the kids, transportation, probably a cell phone. What we realized, and when we went community by community across Long Island, is that for the families making the median income of about 55 or 60 or 65, they had no chance. Zero. And we thought, well, you get that promotion. You get up to 75 or 85 or 95. Guess what? No chance. This family at $106,000 is still barely breaking even. And that's a scary proposition because it illustrates to me that our tax structure in this state is broken. When you make more than $100,000 and you have no chance with just 2 kids, and God forbid something happens, something goes wrong, there's a medical emergency, right? This money you're looking at right here, 19% in income taxes, that's all the itemized deductions, that's the 2 kids, that's the property taxes, that's everything taken away. $8,800 a year in property taxes, 8%. 4% for sales taxes, excise taxes. You buy booze, you buy cigarettes, you fly in a plane, you're paying excise taxes. When you start to think about your relationship with government, adding all this stuff up becomes impossible. You woke up this morning, you washed your face, you ran the water. Well, you had a water bill. You drove your car to work, drove on a paved road. That was taxes. You went to work, you paid income taxes, you got home, you paid property taxes. Each step along the way, we start to see this transaction that happens, right? We've paid something for government and we've got something in return. And if you told me, devise a system where you can pick almost all the money out of my pocket without me knowing it, this is what I'd do. Little by little, death by 1,000 paper cuts. And that's essentially the system we have. New York is the most tax-unfriendly state in the country because they find all of these different ways to take it out. Now, our organization is not focused on running around the state, scaring everybody into oblivion and saying, we got to lower the taxes and that's going to solve everything. We have high taxes because we have a spending problem, right? We have high taxes because the economic development strategy in New York State, in Albany, and in the mayor's office in New York City is based around the idea that I know best. I'm going to take your money and spend it for you on items that I know to be true. Well, guess what? It's not working, right? And we have history to tell us that, but we also now have the last 4 or 5 years. Startup New York, $56 million on branding. We just renamed it because it didn't work. Maybe a new name is what we were missing. I tend to think that's not the case. This family knows it's not the case because they can't afford to stay here. The picture gets worse when you start going down the ladder. Let's take a recent graduate. Now, the average starting salary in the US for a recent graduate, mind you, we're going to get really thin here, who gets a job in their career field of study, is $48,707. This person, again, trying to live in Port Washington, where he was raised, is left with 0%. Basic expenses, 67%. Sales taxes, property taxes. What I noticed among my generation, you get in a room of 50 millennials, you say, how many of you pay property taxes? One or two guys bought their first home at 27, they raise their hand, and no one else pays property taxes, right? Amazing trick. Just because you're a renter, you still pay property taxes. You just don't pay them to the government, of course. Again, we're not aware of it. And it's worse because you don't get the itemized deduction. This problem is something that doesn't go away because every day graduates are realizing that they have choices. Now, this 48,000 number aligns almost directly with what Stony Brook is averaging for their graduates right now. And I want to paint a picture that makes this even worse. When you graduate, imagine you're 22 and you have an option between Texas or New York. 48,000 either way, and we're going to build in a 2.5% raise year on year. Now, one of your first big life events is going to be buying a home. On Long Island, that home's a $382,000 median income home. 20% down means you need to find a way to get $80,000 in the bank. A 22-year-old making $48,000 a year will take 17 years to save that $80,000. You're now 39 when you buy your first home. In Dallas County, Texas, you have the money to buy that home at 27. You don't have state income tax in Texas, yet they still have roads, they still have schools. They've figured out a way to make it work. At 27, you have your first home in Texas. Now you're going to go 12 years up to 39. In that time alone, not paying state income tax means you saved $190,000. You paid for your kid's first 4 years at Texas A&M. Let's hope he graduates in 4 years. So now let's go back to New York. 39, I took out my 30-year mortgage. It's going to take me 30 years to pay it off. And in that time, I bought my home once in the principal, a second time in the interest, and a third time in the property taxes. I'm 69 and I own one home. I've paid for 3. And oh, by the way, I still have about $1,000 a month in property tax to pay until I retire and hopefully until I move away because I can't afford it. This is the reality of our future tax base. Government can't shrink itself quick enough to catch up with the fact that people are moving to North Carolina and Texas and Florida every day because it makes economic sense. They don't want to move, but it makes economic sense to move. 1.8 million people in the last 15 years have left New York. We lead the country. The number one reason cited is affordability. I share these stats because, as the speaker before me said, the budget is going up. We are the ones that will have to pay that. And until we wake up enough people and say, this only gets better when we engage, it will not get better. So when I go around the state, and we've now put regional directors in 4 different regions, we'll be in 5 regions and then New York by the end of this year. We're meeting people who for the first time feel like, I had no idea I was paying 30% of my income to government, and they are outraged because they start asking the value question. And I argue that only then, when we really think about what we pay and what we get back, like the guy fixing our roof, here's $1,000, I want my money back because you didn't fix my roof. We should think that way about education. We should think that way about paving roads and building bridges. But we don't have that relationship with government, right? We don't believe we can make a difference. We're just one person. They don't listen. They're all corrupt. It starts in rooms like this where we begin to see that we actually can make a difference, that 75 people can show up on a Thursday night because they care. We are in the middle of budget season right now in New York City. We get an initial budget, it goes to the city council, they come back, they make some edits, we get a second budget, and then hopefully by July 1 it's all wrapped up. Now, the current mayor, in his 3 years, as it was stated earlier, has added about 25% onto the budget. We're at $84.7 billion. When we think about the New York City budget, I encourage you to think about it in the context of another state. If New York City were a state, we would be the 7th largest state when it comes to a budget. But we're a state within a state, which is even more troublesome because we still have this sort of parent-child relationship. Currently, the two parents aren't getting along. Maybe it's a divorcee relationship. But ultimately, from a budgeting standpoint, whoever is mayor has almost one of his hands tied behind his back because it's difficult to understand how he can put all of the pieces in place when he's got someone who's not exactly working with him. You see here, in Bloomberg's last year at $72.7 billion, he was almost 20% less than what it is now. And we've added about 5% to the budget every year. The increase that we take on every year, of course, is paid by taxpayers. Our key budget drivers really fall into 3 areas: education, social services, and administration of justice. Now, far and away, education is the biggest cost driver at 35% of the budget. 35% of the budget, and most of that, of course, is driven by personnel costs. This is what we're paying teachers and administrators. Now, in 2013, if you all remember, nearly all of the public unions had their contracts held out. They didn't want to negotiate with Bloomberg. They were going to wait over and see what happened, see who got elected. Well, in 2013, all of those contracts got cashed in. But they didn't get cashed in at 1- and 2-year deals. They got cashed in at 4- and 5- and 6- and 8-year deals. So what that last slide doesn't tell you is you see this sort of cost curve, which more or less looks okay, right? There was that uptick after 2013. But we're looking at contracts where they're backloaded, and that money will strongly come due in 2018, 2019, and 21. So we've already signed that away. We just, of course, haven't seen the tax bill come in yet. Let's talk about education, because it is the biggest cost driver. What we pay per pupil in New York City is nearly double the national average, $19,000. The state average is $22,000. We are the highest by almost $5,000 per pupil. Now, where we started this conversation was around value. If I told you, I need you to pay $19,000 per student, but every one of our kids graduates and goes to Harvard. Right? We think about it. Maybe. But that's not the case. The NAEP rankings, which is the gold standard for 4th and 8th grade math and reading levels, has New York State at 34th. They don't do it by city, but they do the scoring by city. And New York City scores worse than New York State. So I can't tell you how much worse than 34th we are, but we know best case scenario is 35th if we were a state. How are we putting ourselves in a position to pay far and away the most of any state, but get the 34th or 5th or 50th best education? It doesn't make sense. This year, like many of the issues, our solution is to throw more money at it. We're going to add $1 billion into education. Now, what troubles me is that this isn't one of those problems that, again, we don't know how to fix, right? So many free market, supporters walk around and say, if only we could implement these ideas, right? We actually know what is working right now in education. There's some great examples out there. One of these is based around the idea of choice, of letting the market work. School choice is having success all across this country. After New Orleans got wiped out with Hurricane Katrina, some smart people sat in a room and said, how are we going to rebuild the schools? And they said, let's do it with a charter-only approach. Now, I'm not going to stand here in this room tonight and tell you that charters are a panacea, that they alone will solve things. They are a part of a comprehensive solution. But they're the only part of that right now that's actually producing results. Not all of them. Some charters work and some don't. But the beauty of the model is if it doesn't work, you make a change. We're not locked into a system that punishes students without choice. About 6 or 7 months back, I don't know if you remember, there was a big hubbub over Chick-fil-A, right, in Manhattan. There was a new Chick-fil-A out. And the mayor said, we don't like the owners of Chick-fil-A. I don't think the food's that good. I don't like their chicken. Fine. But he said the beauty of this is that people can vote with their feet. If you don't like the chicken, you don't have to eat it. You don't have to go there. Don't patronize the restaurant. And we raised our hands and we said, Mayor, can we just apply that same principle to schools? Because if we do, I've got a pretty good feeling we're going to see some solutions. Well, that's crazy talk. The idea behind choice is simple, and you think it would be even more important when you're talking about your son or daughter. Our organization looks to take examples like that and put them into the mainstream, right? Through live in-person conversations, through digital, we're on Facebook, we're getting the message out there. But not to say that the theory of free market means more choice and a trickle down and we'll have a better school and we'll get rid of that school and stop. Tell them about Chick-fil-A, right? They understand that. Ultimately, he's not in favor of choice, as are many legislators in this state, because 79% of the charter school requests for space have been denied. Right? You can't argue with the fact that parents are dying to win that lottery so their child has a chance. But yet, we have elected officials that don't want to give them that chance. During Bloomberg's tenure, he closed 150 failing schools. De Blasio has closed 8. And those are only schools that were closed recently. Ideally, we're starting to get the idea that the goal is not to save a building or an institution that isn't working. It's to educate children. All through the news in the past 2 weeks, you've seen a lot of talk about homelessness. The mayor got hung out to dry this week by the New York Times and by the Daily News because he can't seem to fix homelessness. I don't begin to believe that that's an easy solution, right? We're talking about substance abuse problem, we're talking about learning disabilities, we're talking about people who are disconnected from their family units. They don't have a family structure in place to support them. But what I don't buy into is the idea that more money solves this problem. And that's essentially what we've had for the past 3 years. You look at the uptick since 2013, the day we more or less started saying we can fix all of these problems. If you're homeless, come to New York City and we'll make it okay. Numbers have shot up through the roof. So now we're talking about, the word comprehensive gets thrown around all the time in the past 2 weeks. Comprehensive solution to homelessness. When we look at the models that are working out there, you've got examples like the Doe Fund, putting people back to work, skills-based learning, right? These things do cost money, but they need to be part of the solution, and we haven't heard that for the past 3 years. Ultimately, what we're going to see in this budget is about a $500 million increase. And we're going to be putting these shelters all over the city. We've heard a lot about that in the past 2 days. But when we think about this from a business case perspective, that's not how you solve the problem. It doesn't work in education. It doesn't work in homelessness. The onus is on us as citizens to raise our hand and say, we can do better than this. I expect more. You were elected to produce results, or at the least to have a plan. The one area I would argue in the budget that is large where we have seen continued success is under the stewardship of Commissioner Bratton. Crime levels have essentially remained flat since 2009. We've seen a small dip and we're at our lowest murder rate in the past 30 years. And so we all want to keep our fingers crossed that that continues. But at the same time, we've seen an uptick in the cost of that since 2013. I could go through 5 or 6 more issues, but I think you'd start to get the point, because it's the same in New York City as it is in New York State. The idea is that if we just invest enough money, it will fix itself. And I know best. And that's just not the case. You know, we're seeing economic development corporations allegedly using regional economic development councils to decentralize the decision making. The journalist calls it the Hunger Games, because literally they dole out $7 billion, with the journalist, anchor, newswoman up on stage handing out big checks to the regions around the state. And they're not producing jobs. We have to be the ones that raise our hand and say this idea of crony capitalism doesn't work. Why would I force one New Yorker to pay for the tax subsidy of another New Yorker? Peter and Paul. It's a basic idea. But again, as long as we allow that power to be centralized and that money to be spent, we are not empowered to push back. We've talked so far about how we're going to spend this money, but here's the scary part. How do we get the money? The revenue sources ultimately represent a castle built on quicksand. If you look at the 27% coming in state and federal, right now some of that state money is being withheld because the governor and the mayor aren't getting along. The property tax, personal income tax, sales tax, business income, and real estate taxes account for 63% of our total revenue. And as any good investor will tell you, we need to diversify. And this is what the best states are doing. This is what the Texases and the Floridas are doing. They're rebuilding their economy by not putting all of their eggs in one basket. Over the past year, actually over the past 5 years, we've seen the sales tax income continually go down. And ultimately, this 63% is leaning heavily on the financial sector in New York City. So if you go back to 2011, when one domino falls, incomes start to drop because companies lay people off, which means we buy less ice cream, which means less sales taxes. We buy less property, which means less real estate transactions. And you start to see where we've built a castle that can't stand when the debts get called in. We call it New York City's volatile sugar daddy. The real estate industry, sales, owner-occupied properties, personal income. You want to diversify your revenue sources so you can ensure that through the hard times, you're in a place to survive the storm. So where we are right now is this $84.7 billion budget. We're expecting tax revenue to go down over the next 3 years. Sales tax revenue is already going down. And this whole presentation made all the sense in the world until Inauguration Day, and the markets turned around and went back up. So let's keep our fingers crossed that keeps happening, because if it does, the model works. But from a planning standpoint, I wouldn't want to build a business around that theory. The big number at the bottom is the scary one, $112 billion in outstanding debt. Now, if you remember, Detroit went through a bit of a problem a couple of years back. Detroit's annual budget is just over $20 billion. At the time that city went bankrupt, they had about $22 billion in outstanding debt. Revenues expected at $20 billion, outstanding debt at 22. We're at 84, we have outstanding debt of 112. As long as we can rely on financial sector, those debts don't get called in and it makes sense. But we need to be cognizant that that may not last forever. When we stop tonight, I hope maybe you remember the 84.7 billion. But the takeaway on this is really, we need to be cognizant about where this train is going, right? I don't know that we can actually pull this number back in the short term, but ultimately, we need to be encouraging our friends to be aware of what percentage of that number they're gonna pay. On our website, reclaimnewyork.org, you can punch in your income, you can enter in your stats, and you can see what percentage of your taxes are going to federal, to state, to local. And ultimately, you're gonna have a nice little pie chart which spits out like the one you saw before, where you can start to assess how much am I paying government and how much am I getting back. I make the argument that for too long, we've talked about outsourcing in the wrong way. Outsourcing is something we have been doing with our civic duty. Ultimately, it is on us to get involved, to show up to vote, to go to your town hall meetings, to go to your local district meetings, and to tell people that you're there. In 1974, we had a 76% voter turnout in the gubernatorial. Look at what our voter turnout has done all the way down to 2014, when it was 28.8%. We are signaling to elected officials and to public officials, just as importantly, that we're actually not paying attention. We're not minding the store. And when we're not minding the store, people are in a position to make bad decisions. We've had more than 36 state officials be forced out of office or leave under a cloud of suspicion in just the past 10 years. That is on us. We have to communicate to them that we want better, that we want to do more. So my ask for all of you tonight is pretty simple. I accept all checks over $1 million if you'd like to fund our organization. But ultimately, we want to engage all of you and your neighbors. We want to come out to your chambers of commerce, to your Rotary, to your Knights of Columbus. We want to share this information. We are about to launch a second organization. As was mentioned earlier, we're a 501c3. We're nonpartisan, we're nonprofit. We're about to launch a 501c4, which allows us to do issue advocacy and push for these issues, both at the county level, the town level, the city level, and of course in Albany. So I thank you all so much for having us out tonight. We're so excited to be doing this work.
Questions, so fire away.
Yeah, I got a question.
Sir.
You have two questions. You have solutions to a lot of these problems, and now that you say you want to open this other thing, it sounds like you want to be a lobbyist. Do you have political aspirations?
Me personally?
Yeah. Solutions first, answer that one first.
Part of the reason for opening the second organization is because of solutions. So if you go on our website, we talk about how we would solve education affordability, right? The solutions here, we have not lacked solutions, right? The idea of fixing economies has been the same for a very long time. What we can't do is implement it well. We've been very ineffective at doing that. And I argue we put too much focus on electing the right people, where we should be educating enough people. So once those people get elected, they're actually going to feel the support of people like this room to say, hey, this is how we should vote on an issue. Under the IRS 501c3 nonprofit, we can't go into encouraging people to make that right decision. Under the C4, we can. And so what I would argue when it comes to lobbying, you could send me up to Albany to walk the halls and knock on doors, but there's people that do that already, that are on retainer, that live up there. You want to talk about making a difference, it's enough people in the districts that when we say it's time for an activation, we're going to do one call every 10 minutes for 8 hours. We're going to send 50 letters today, we're going to hit them on Facebook, we're going to talk on Twitter. It's going to be all of the above, right? And so what our organization can do when you're ready to do a walk, for instance, you want to hit a neighborhood with 500 pieces of literature to help people understand where you are in this issue, give us a phone call. We want to talk about those issues that we can support you on. Yes?
Just a quick question. When you were talking about the real estate taxes in Port Washington at only $8,800, how recent is that?
Fair question. It completely depends on the home value. So for that home value, you're talking about it was $100,000. You're talking about a $340,000 home value. Now, if you have a $700,000 home value, you can double that number. And a lot of the people that we met with that night in Port Washington a couple of weeks ago, they were paying $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 in property taxes.
That 8,800 figure,
It's a dream.
It's a dream. It's
a dream. Sir.
You talked a lot about the inefficiency of what the government is doing. And when you spoke about homelessness, you made a statement that said a lot. It's a hard thing to solve this. We don't need to necessarily solve the whole problem, but it's ridiculous how much it's grown. And like we have 20% of the people in the homeless shelters from out of state. We have a situation where irresponsible parents are maybe taking drugs, they're living with their mother. Instead of being with the grandmother, the kid is being taken to the shelter. So that's immoral, where the grandmother could be raising that kid. Instead, we're tax dollars are putting that kid with an irresponsible parent. And there's so many, in Giuliani's administration, they went to people. If you have family, they questioned them, they quizzed them. You have a brother, why are you living with your brother? They push them on that. now we're letting everybody in
You
who
hit a
not
key
staying in.
piece. You know, when we have people who live in Hoboken and they just have to take the subway over, and now it's New York's problem.
But it's important.
It's not
When you say
sustainable.
this, you can't say it's a hard issue to solve. More than half of that is very easy to solve with some sensible, common sense restrictions that we've had in the past that we got rid of.
Right, and hopefully we'll have.
And getting rid of Commissioner Banks would solve a lot of problems by itself.
Yeah.
Sir.
Get rid of banks. Build a wall.
You drive down Northern Boulevard, and it's just one, and the number of vacant stores, out of business, small businesses from the Nassau border until you make it into Manhattan, these businesses have failed. How many of them do you think have failed because their expenses, their taxes, and the burdens put on them by the city make it impossible for them to remain in business, and then that adds to the unemployment and the homelessness. It seems like the whole thing's spiraling completely out of control. The cost,
You're right.
the revenue is going down, and the taxes spent are going up. Sooner or later, those lines cross, and we're out of business.
Well, and that's where we are. We have the 49th ranked business climate in the country for a reason. And it's because the government wants to have this role in the direction of the economy versus allowing business owners to do what they do, which is create jobs. So ultimately, we've got to address the theory behind this spending because that justifies the tax grab. Unless we have people in Albany who say, guess what, I don't know best. You elected me to stay off your back. Thank you all so much. I appreciate the time.
Let's give Brandon Muir a big round of applause. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation.